London, January 1818. The laundry room of St. Agatha Workhouse in Southwark reeked of lye soap and desperation, steam rising from iron tubs like the breath of forgotten souls. Grace Marlowe stood at the third washboard from the window, her hands raw and reddened from 14 hours of scrubbing garments that would never belong to her, for people who would never see her face. At 21 years of age, she had spent nearly every conscious moment of her life within these gray stone walls, invisible to the world beyond. The water scalded her fingers, but Grace had learned long ago not to flinch. Pain was a luxury she could not afford to acknowledge. Around her, 12 other women worked in silence, their backs bent in identical postures of defeat. This was the rhythm of her existence, the only life she had ever known. No family had come for her. No benefactor had noticed her. She was, as Mistress Grimsby, the workhouse directress, often reminded her, too quiet and too plain to be worth anyone's notice or charity. It was then that the morning routine shattered in a most unexpected manner. The heavy oak door to the laundry swung open with unusual force. Grace glanced up from her washboard to see Mistress Grimsby herself entering, her gray bombazine gown rustling with agitation. Behind her walked a man so utterly foreign to this place that several women stopped their scrubbing entirely. He was tall, perhaps 40 years of age, dressed in a coat of superfine wool, the deep blue of midnight, his cravat tied with such precision it seemed almost a rebuke to their squalor. His eyes, dark and intense, swept the room with the systematic efficiency of someone accustomed to taking inventory of a vast estate. "Continue your work," Mistress Grimsby snapped at the staring women. Her voice carried its usual sharp edge, but Grace detected something else beneath it. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. The gentleman did not speak immediately. Instead, he withdrew a piece of faded fabric from his coat pocket. Grace's heart stuttered in her chest. She knew that fabric. It was the only possession she had brought with her into this world, or so she had been told by the woman who had died when Grace was barely 8 years old, the woman she had called Nurse Betty, though she knew not if that was truly her name or role. "I am seeking a young woman," the gentleman said, his voice cultured and commanding. She would be approximately 21 years of age. She was brought here as an infant in 1797. This, he held up the fabric, was wrapped around her when she arrived. Grace's hands stilled in the wash water. The embroidered letters on that scrap of cloth had been her only comfort during countless sleepless nights. G.M. The directress had told her they meant nothing, that some seamstress had merely marked her work. But Grace had spent hours tracing those letters with her fingertips, imagining they stood for something more. Mistress Grimsby's expression transformed into a mask of calculated concern. "I am afraid, my lord, that we keep impeccable records, and I have no papers regarding any infant arriving in that year bearing such an item." The girl's name would have been Grace Marlowe, the gentleman continued, his gaze sharp. Her father was Thomas Marlowe of Hampshire. The room seemed to contract around Grace. Marlowe. That was her surname then. She had always been simply Grace, no family name to claim, no lineage to trace. Her fingers trembled against the washboard. "We have no one by that name in our registry," Mistress Grimsby insisted. But her eyes, Grace noticed, flickered briefly in her direction before darting away. The gentleman's jaw tightened. He strode forward, his polished boots clicking against the wet stone floor with each deliberate step. "Perhaps your records are incomplete. Perhaps you might inquire among the women here assembled." It was a command, not a request. Mistress Grimsby's hands clenched in the folds of her gown. "That would be most irregular, my lord. These women are here to work, not to be questioned about matters of which they have no knowledge." But the gentleman had already turned his attention to the women at the washboards. His gaze moved from face to face, methodical and searching. When his eyes reached Grace, they stopped. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Grace felt as though she were being examined, not merely with sight but with some deeper faculty, as though he could perceive the very essence of her being. "You," he said quietly. "What is your name?" Grace's throat had gone dry. She had been trained since childhood not to speak unless spoken to directly, and even then to keep her words brief and deferential. But something in this man's voice compelled honesty. "Grace, my lord." "Grace what?" She hesitated. "I have no surname, my lord. I am only Grace." The gentleman's expression shifted, something fierce and sorrowful crossing his features. "How long have you been in this workhouse?" "All my life, my lord. Since I was an infant, or so I have been told." "You were never adopted? Never claimed by family?" "No, my lord." He took 3 steps closer. Grace could now see the lines at the corners of his eyes, marks of both age and what appeared to be long-carried grief. "Do you know anything of your origins? Anything at all?" Grace glanced at Mistress Grimsby, whose face had gone pale as chalk. The directress gave the smallest shake of her head, a warning. But Grace had spent 21 years being warned, being silenced, being told she was nothing and no one. Some part of her, the part that had secretly taught herself arithmetic from a tattered copy of the Young Merchant's Guide she had found in the rubbish, the part that had memorized the patterns of Mistress Grimsby's fraudulent bookkeeping, that part refused to be silenced any longer. "I had a piece of cloth once," she said softly. "It was taken from me when I was 8 years old. Mistress Grimsby said it was too fine for someone like me to possess. It had letters embroidered on it. G and M. The gentleman's hand opened, revealing the very fabric Grace had just described. The morning light streaming through the high windows caught the faded silk, illuminating the delicate stitches that formed those 2 precious letters. Grace's breath caught in her throat. "This cloth?" "Yes, my lord." "Then you are Grace Marlowe," he said, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. "Daughter of Thomas Marlowe, who was a gentleman of Hampshire and one of the dearest friends I ever had the privilege to know." The laundry room erupted in whispers. Mistress Grimsby stepped forward, her composure cracking. "This is quite impossible. The girl has no documentation, no proof of such lineage. She is a foundling, nothing more." "She is documented," the gentleman countered, producing a sheaf of papers from his coat. "I have here the marriage certificate of Thomas Marlowe to Sarah Patterson, dated May 17th, 1796. I have the baptismal record of Grace Marlowe, born April 3rd, 1797, at the parish church in Basingstoke. And I have," his voice hardened, "Thomas Marlowe's will, in which he left a trust fund of £1,500 for his daughter's care, to be administered by a Mistress Patterson of Hampshire, should anything befall him." Grace felt the world tilting beneath her feet. She gripped the edge of the washboard to steady herself. A father. She had a father who had left her something, who had thought of her, who had cared enough to provide for her future. "Mistress Patterson died in 1799, the gentleman continued. "The infant Grace was sent to this workhouse in her stead. But it appears," his gaze cut to Mistress Grimsby like a blade, "that proper papers were never filed, that the trust fund was never claimed, that this young woman has been kept in illegal servitude for 21 years. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire beneath the great kettles seemed to quiet, as though the very room held its breath. Mistress Grimsby's face had gone from pale to grey. "I do not know what you think you have discovered, my lord, but I can assure you that all customs here are conducted according to the strictest legal requirements." "Then you will have no objection," the gentleman said coldly, "to an immediate inspection of your records by the parish authorities. I am Victor Hawthorne, Earl of Kingsmere. I served as executor of Thomas Marlowe's estate, and that trust fund I mentioned has been growing under my management for the past 21 years. It now stands at £4,500. I should very much like to know why the rightful beneficiary has been washing laundry in this establishment, rather than living as the gentlewoman she was born to be." Grace's knees buckled. £4,500. It was an inconceivable sum, enough to live on comfortably for decades, enough to ensure her independence and security for the rest of her life. And yet she had been here, her hands destroyed by lie, her back bent over washboards, her mind starved for any knowledge beyond these walls. Mistress Grimsby's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line of terror. There must be some mistake. The girl's mother was a servant. She was born out of wedlock. Her mother was Sarah Patterson, daughter of a respectable Hampshire farmer, Lord Hawthorne corrected. She married Thomas Marlowe in a proper church ceremony. I have the certificate, signed by the rector himself. Grace Marlowe is legitimate. She is an heiress, and she has been grievously wronged. The Earl turned back to Grace, and his expression softened. Miss Marlowe, I know this must be overwhelming. I knew your father well. He was a good man, a scholarly man, who died far too young when you were scarcely 2 years old. On his deathbed, he made me promise that if anything should happen to Mistress Patterson, I would find you and ensure you were cared for. I have failed in that promise for far too long, but I am here now, and I swear to you that I will set right what has been allowed to go so terribly wrong. Grace found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. My lord, I do not understand. If my father left me in Mistress Patterson's care and she died, why was I not given to you? Because, Lord Hawthorne's voice turned bitter. Mistress Patterson's niece, who handled her affairs after her death, was poorly educated and knew only that there was a child to be sent to London. She found this workhouse through a local parish connection and believed she was doing right by you. She had no knowledge of your father's arrangements, no knowledge of the trust fund. And his voice broke slightly, I had no knowledge of you at all. Thomas spoke of you in his final days, but in his delirium, I believed he was speaking of hopes and dreams, not of an actual daughter already born. It was only 3 weeks ago, while organizing old papers in preparation for taking inventory of the estate library, that I found his letter, sealed and hidden among books we had shared. In it, he told me everything. And I have been searching for you every day since. Tears blurred Grace's vision. A father who had loved her. A man who had made provisions for her. A life stolen by circumstance and negligence. I have been here all along, she said, her voice breaking. 21 years, right here. I know, Lord Hawthorne said gently, and I cannot give you back those years, but I can give you your future. You are no longer bound to this place. You are a gentlewoman of independent means. The law is on your side, and I am on your side. Will you allow me to take you from here? Grace looked around the laundry room. The other women were staring at her with expressions ranging from astonishment to envy. Mistress Grimsby stood frozen, clearly calculating whether denial or cooperation would serve her best. And Grace, who had never made a decision for herself in her entire life, who had never been permitted to want or hope for anything beyond her next meal and a dry place to sleep, felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It was fury, pure, righteous fury at the life that had been taken from her, at the years stolen, at the casual cruelty that had kept her invisible and voiceless while her inheritance gathered dust. And alongside that fury burned something else, determination. Yes, my lord, she said, her voice growing stronger. I will come with you. But first, I would like to see the workhouse records that Mistress Grimsby claims are so impeccably kept. Lord Hawthorne's eyes gleamed with approval. An excellent notion, Miss Marlowe. I should very much like to see those records as well. What followed was a revelation that Grace had long suspected but never dared to voice. The workhouse ledgers, when finally produced under the Earl's inexorable demand, showed a systematic pattern of fraud. Donations meant for the care of the poor had been diverted. Food purchases had been inflated on paper, while the actual meals served were pitiful. And most damningly, there was no record of Grace Marlowe anywhere in the official registry. She existed in the daily work logs, her labor tracked with the same impersonal precision as the laundry tallies and coal consumption. But officially, legally, she did not exist at all. "You have been using her as unpaid labor," Lord Hawthorne said, his voice dangerously quiet. "For 13 years, since she was 8 years old and able to work. That is slavery, madam. That is a crime." Mistress Grimsby attempted one final defense. "The girl had nowhere else to go. I kept her out of Christian charity." "You kept her," Grace heard herself say, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Because I could calculate your false ledgers in my head. You kept me because I was useful and because I knew too much. Every time the parish inspectors came, you locked me in the coal cellar or sent me on some errand far from the house. You could not afford for anyone to question why an able-bodied young woman was being kept without wages, without papers, without any legal standing at all." The Earl looked at Grace with new respect. "You knew?" "I taught myself arithmetic from a discarded merchant's primer I salvaged from the bin," Grace explained. "Numbers do not lie, my lord. I have known for years that Mistress Grimsby was stealing from the donations. I simply had no power to stop her." "You have power now," Lord Hawthorne said, "and I promise you, this institution will be investigated from foundation to rafters." Within the hour, Grace walked out of St. Agatha Workhouse for the first time in her conscious memory. She wore the same rough gray dress she had worn that morning, carried nothing but the embroidered cloth that Lord Hawthorne had returned to her. But she walked through those doors as Grace Marlowe, daughter of Thomas Marlowe, heiress to £4,500 and under the protection of one of England's most respected peers. The Earl's carriage waited in the narrow street. It was a magnificent vehicle, all polished wood and brass fittings, drawn by 4 matched bay horses. Grace had seen carriages before, of course, glimpsed through windows or when running errands, but she had never imagined herself inside one. Lord Hawthorne handed her up the steps himself, his manner courteous and gentle. "I am taking you to Kingsmere Hall in Surrey," he explained as the carriage began to move. "It is my principal seat. You will be safe there, and we shall determine the best course forward for your future." Grace sat rigidly on the cushioned bench. Her hand hovered over the squabs of velvet upholstery, hesitating to let her rough, chapped fingers touch such exquisite fabric for fear of snagging the silk or leaving a stain of lye. Through the window, London scrolled past, a city she had lived in all her life yet never truly seen. "My lord," she said hesitantly, "I do not know how to be what you say I am. I can barely read. I have no accomplishments, no education, no understanding of how a gentlewoman should conduct herself." "You have intelligence," Lord Hawthorne replied firmly. "You taught yourself mathematics from discarded books. You identified systematic fraud. You survived 21 years in conditions that would have broken lesser souls. Those accomplishments, Miss Marlowe, are worth more than 100 watercolor paintings or Italian arias. But I do not know how to manage money, how to make investments, how to protect myself from those who might take advantage." "Then I will teach you," the Earl said simply. "Thomas asked me to care for you. I failed him once. I will not fail him again. And more than that," his voice softened, "you have a right to understand your own inheritance, to make your own decisions. Too many women are kept deliberately ignorant of financial matters, left vulnerable to the whims of fathers and husbands. You will not be one of them." The journey to Surrey took several hours. Grace spent much of it in silence, watching the landscape transform from London's crowded streets to rolling countryside. Lord Hawthorne did not press her for conversation, seemingly content to allow her time to process the extraordinary upheaval of her morning. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks or comment on the estates they passed, his voice gentle and undemanding. "That property belongs to the Marquis of Aldridge," he said at one point, gesturing to a vast estate visible in the distance. "He is a reasonable man, though his countess can be rather particular about propriety. You will likely meet them eventually." Grace nodded, unable to imagine herself in the same social sphere as a marquess and his countess. The very notion seemed absurd. Yet here she sat in an earl's carriage, wearing a borrowed pelisse, being spoken to as though she were a gentlewoman of standing rather than a workhouse laborer. The weight of what had happened pressed upon her chest. Just this morning, she had woken in the dormitory where she had slept for 21 years. She had eaten the same thin gruel she always ate. She had walked to the laundry expecting another day identical to all the days before. And now, everything had changed. Her entire understanding of who she was and where she belonged had been overturned in the span of a few hours. "My lord," she said hesitantly, "may I ask what my father was like?" Lord Hawthorne's expression softened. "Thomas was one of the kindest men I ever knew. We met at Oxford, though he was there on scholarship rather than family wealth. He had a brilliant mind for mathematics and philosophy. We spent countless hours in debate, solving problems, discussing the great questions of existence. After university, he inherited a small property in Hampshire from a distant relation. It was not grand, but it was his, and he worked tirelessly to improve it." "And my mother?" "Sarah Patterson was the daughter of a farmer whose land bordered your father's property. By all accounts, she was a gentle woman of considerable intelligence. Thomas spoke of her with such reverence. He said she had the patience to listen to his wildest theories and the wisdom to point out their flaws. Their marriage was a love match, which was somewhat unusual for his modest position. Many expected him to marry for money to improve his prospects. But Thomas valued happiness over wealth. Grace absorbed this information, building a picture in her mind of the parents she had never known. How did they die? "Your mother died of childbed fever just weeks after you were born," Lord Hawthorne said quietly. Thomas was devastated. He engaged Mistress Patterson, Sarah's aunt, to care for you while he struggled to manage both his grief and his estate. He threw himself into his work, determined to build something substantial to leave to you. But he contracted typhus in 1899, when you were scarcely 2 years old. I was with him at the end. He made me promise to ensure you were cared for, to see that you had every opportunity he could provide. I failed that promise, Grace. I thought he was delirious, speaking of hopes rather than realities. I did not know you existed until I found his letter." "You could not have known," Grace said softly, "and you have found me now. That is what matters." "It has been 21 years, he said, his voice heavy with regret. 21 years you should have spent as his daughter, educated and cherished. Instead, you have known only hardship." "I have also known survival," Grace replied, "and perhaps that will serve me well in ways that comfort never could." Lord Hawthorne looked at her with something approaching wonder. "You have a remarkable spirit, Grace Marlowe. Your father would be extraordinarily proud." Kingsmere Hall appeared as the sun reached its zenith, a magnificent Palladian structure of honey-colored stone set among manicured grounds that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The house itself rose 3 stories, with wings extending on either side of the main block. Tall windows gleamed in the afternoon light. The drive leading to the entrance was lined with ancient oaks, their branches creating a canopy overhead. Grace's breath caught. This was to be her home, at least temporarily. It seemed impossible, a dream from which she might wake at any moment to find herself back at the washboard. She had seen fine houses before, glimpsed through iron gates or from a distance during her rare errands outside the workhouse, but she had never imagined entering one, much less being welcomed as a guest. "It is rather overwhelming at first sight," Lord Hawthorne said, noting her expression. "But I assure you, it is merely a house. Admittedly a large one, but still just rooms and corridors and entirely too many portraits of disapproving ancestors." Despite her anxiety, Grace felt a small smile tug at her lips. "Do the ancestors disapprove of everyone, or am I to be singled out for particular censure?" "They disapprove of me quite regularly," he assured her. "Particularly my great-grandmother Eugenia, whose portrait hangs in the main hall. She has the most forbidding expression imaginable. I am convinced she despised everyone she ever met, including her own family." The carriage drew to a halt before the main entrance. Liveried footmen appeared immediately, one opening the carriage door while another stood ready to assist. Grace hesitated, suddenly acutely aware of her rough dress, her work-damaged hands, her complete ignorance of proper conduct in such circumstances. Lord Hawthorne descended first, then turned to offer his hand. "There is nothing to fear," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "You belong here as much as anyone. More, perhaps, for you have earned your place through your own strength rather than simply being born to it." The household staff had clearly been warned to expect a guest, but their reactions to Grace's appearance ranged from carefully concealed shock to poorly hidden pity. She could well imagine what she looked like: too thin, her hands ruined by labor, her dress more suitable for a scullery maid than a gentlewoman. The housekeeper, a stern-faced woman of perhaps 50 years named Mistress Havering, stepped forward with admirable efficiency. "Welcome to Kingsmere Hall, Miss Marlowe," she said, her voice professionally courteous. "His lordship has instructed that you are to be given every comfort and courtesy." "Thank you, Mistress Havering," Grace managed, though her voice came out barely above a whisper. Lord Hawthorne spoke with quiet authority. "Mistress Havering, Miss Marlowe will require an entire new wardrobe, suitable for a gentlewoman of her station. Send to London for Madame Beaumont immediately. She is to provide everything necessary, sparing no expense." "Very good, my lord, and I have prepared the rose guest chamber as you instructed." "Excellent. Grace," he turned to her, "you must be exhausted. Mistress Havering will show you to your chamber. Rest this afternoon. Take time to accustom yourself to your new surroundings. We shall speak more this evening at dinner, if you feel equal to it. If not, a tray can be sent to your room." Grace nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness. "Thank you, my lord." She was led up a sweeping staircase, the steps covered in a runner so thick and soft that her feet seemed to sink into it. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced aristocrats, their painted eyes following her progress. Grace kept her gaze forward, acutely aware of Mistress Havering's scrutiny. The rose guest chamber proved to be more luxurious than anything Grace had imagined possible. The air smelled of lavender and beeswax rather than lye. The bed was a four-poster hung with silk curtains in a soft pink that matched the upholstery on the chairs. A fire already burned in the marble fireplace, warming the space to a comfort Grace had never experienced. "The bell pull is there." Mistress Havering indicated a embroidered cord near the bed. "Ring if you require anything. Mary will attend you. She is young but capable, and I have instructed her to provide whatever assistance you might need." "I do not require a maid," Grace said quickly. "I am quite capable of tending to myself." Mistress Havering's expression suggested this was precisely what she had expected. "Nevertheless, his lordship has assigned Mary to your service. It would not be appropriate for a young lady of your position to go without proper attendance." Before Grace could protest further, a girl of perhaps 16 entered bearing a pitcher of hot water. She bobbed a curtsy, her eyes round with curiosity. "Begging your pardon, miss. I am Mary. I have brought water for washing." Grace thanked her, aware of how strange she must appear. The girl's dress, though simple, was cleaner and finer than anything Grace had owned before today. Her hands were soft, unmarked by the harsh labor that had destroyed Grace's. It seemed absurd that this girl should serve someone so obviously beneath her in experience and refinement. When she was finally alone, Grace examined her reflection in the looking-glass above the washstand. A stranger looked back. Thin face, gray eyes too large for her features, brown hair that had never known a proper styling, hanging in a rough plait down her back. Her skin was pale from years of working indoors, marked here and there with small scars from splashed lye or careless encounters with hot irons. She did not look like someone worth £4,500. She did not look like someone worth finding. But Lord Hawthorne had found her. Against all odds, all probability, he had honored a dying man's request and searched until he succeeded. That fact alone seemed worth holding on to, an anchor in this sea of disorienting luxury. That evening, Grace dined alone in her chamber. The food arrived on a silver tray: roasted chicken, delicate vegetables, bread still warm from the oven, and a pudding so rich it made her almost weep. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. Night fell, bringing a darkness deeper than the city ever allowed. Grace lay in the softest bed she had ever known, but sleep eluded her. The silence of the great house was heavy and absolute. For 21 years, she had slept to the sound of coughing, weeping, and the restless shifting of 12 other women in a crowded dormitory. This quiet was a strange, suffocating blanket that left her staring wide-eyed at the canopy above, listening to the pounding of her own heart until dawn finally broke. Morning came, and with it, a new routine that could not have been more different from her previous existence. After a breakfast that seemed almost sinfully abundant, Lord Hawthorne met her in the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with books. The door remained propped open, and a maid sat quietly in the corner with her needlework to ensure propriety was observed. "This is where your education begins," he said, gesturing to a table prepared with paper, ink, and several ledgers. "I am going to teach you everything you need to know to manage your inheritance." And so he did. Over the following weeks, Grace discovered that her aptitude for numbers was not merely sufficient, but exceptional. Lord Hawthorne taught her the principles of investment, the reading of contracts, the assessment of property values. He explained the workings of the funds, the risks and rewards of various ventures, and the importance of spreading one's capital across different assets. Grace absorbed it all with a hunger that seemed to surprise even herself. For the first time in her life, knowledge was not something to be hoarded and hidden, practiced in secret moments stolen from labor. It was freely given, openly discussed, encouraged. She asked questions without fear of punishment. She made calculations without worrying about the cost of wasted paper. She learned. It was during the third week that she made her first significant discovery. Lord Hawthorne had given her the ledgers for the small Hampshire property she had inherited from her father, asking her to review the accounts and identify any irregularities. Within an hour, Grace found it. "The tenant, Mr. Wickham, claims to pay £120 per annum in rent," she said, pointing to the entries. "But according to these receipts, he has been subletting the eastern fields to a neighboring farmer for an additional £60 per year. That income is not being reported to you." Lord Hawthorne examined the ledgers with growing astonishment. "You are quite right. My own land agent missed this entirely. That is theft, pure and simple. Shall I calculate the amount owed based on the dates of these receipts?" "If you would be so kind." Grace's mind worked through the numbers with the ease of long practice. "Over the past 5 years, Mr. Wickham has diverted £300 that rightfully belonged to my father's estate. With compound interest calculated at 5% per annum, the total owed is £368 and 15 shillings. Lord Hawthorne sat back in his chair, studying her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Miss Marlowe, you are extraordinary." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I merely did the arithmetic, my lord." "You did far more than arithmetic. You identified a pattern of fraud, calculated the losses, and determined the proper remedy. That requires not just mathematical skill, but analytical thinking and attention to detail. These are rare gifts." "I had much practice finding patterns at the workhouse," Grace said quietly. "It was a matter of survival, knowing what was happening even when I could not speak of it." The Earl's expression darkened. "The parish investigation into St. Agatha's is proceeding. Mistress Grimsby has been arrested. The evidence you provided regarding the fraudulent bookkeeping was instrumental." "Good," Grace said, and was surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "She destroyed lives through her greed. How many children suffered because she stole the money meant for their care?" "Too many," Lord Hawthorne agreed. "But thanks to your testimony, her crimes will not go unpunished. The workhouse is being reorganized under new management, and several other children have been discovered who, like you, were being kept in illegal circumstances." They returned to their lessons. As the weeks turned into months, Grace's education expanded beyond financial matters. Lord Hawthorne hired a tutor to improve her reading, which was rudimentary at best. A dancing master was brought in, though Grace protested that she had no need of such accomplishments. "You may not need them for managing your money," the Earl said gently, "but you will need them for navigating society. Whether you choose to enter it or not, you should have that choice. Your father would have wanted you to have every opportunity." Grace learned to dance, though she stumbled often and found the whole business rather absurd. She learned to sit properly, to move with grace, to moderate her voice and her gestures according to the invisible rules that govern the ton. It was, in its way, as complex and demanding as mastering compound interest calculations. But it was during the quiet evenings in the library, working through investment strategies and property management with Lord Hawthorne, that Grace felt most herself. Numbers made sense. They had rules that did not change based on who was calculating them. They were honest in a way that society could never be. She also began to notice Lord Hawthorne himself, not merely as her benefactor and teacher, but as a man. He was 42 years old, she knew, a widower for 12 years. His wife had died in childbirth, the baby dying with her, and by all accounts he had never recovered from the loss. The servants spoke of him as the grief Earl, a man who had locked away his heart and devoted himself entirely to duty. But Grace saw moments when that grief lifted, when he smiled at one of her questions or laughed at her frank assessments of some absurd social custom. In those moments, he seemed younger, lighter, almost happy. She tried not to dwell on such observations. He was an earl, a man of wealth and position. She was a former workhouse inmate with ruined hands and no social graces. The gulf between them was vast and unbridgeable. But still, she caught herself watching him when he was absorbed in reading, noting the way he tapped his finger against the page when he encountered an interesting passage, or how his entire face transformed when he was genuinely pleased by something. It was inappropriate. It was foolish. But the heart, Grace was learning, rarely consulted the head on matters of affection. 6 months after arriving at Kingsmere Hall, Grace received an invitation that would test everything she had learned. Lady Minerva Hartwell, a neighboring gentlewoman of impeccable social standing, was hosting a dinner party. Lord Hawthorne, as a respected member of the local gentry, was invited, and he had requested that Grace be included as well. "It will be your formal introduction to society," he explained. "Lady Minerva is a reasonable woman, not given to excessive scandal-mongering. If she accepts you, others will follow." Grace's stomach twisted with anxiety. "My lord, I do not know if I am ready for such an examination." "You are more than ready," he said firmly. "You are intelligent, well-spoken, and in possession of a considerable fortune. Those facts alone guarantee you a measure of respect. The rest will follow from your own character." The evening of the dinner arrived with all the inexorable certainty of fate. Grace dressed in one of her new gowns, a pale blue silk that Madame Beaumont had assured her was perfectly appropriate for a dinner party. The modiste had arrived from London 3 weeks prior with an assistant and what seemed like endless bolts of fabric, taking Grace's measurements with professional efficiency and creating a wardrobe suitable for a gentlewoman of independent means. The transformation had been startling. Grace now owned morning dresses and afternoon dresses, evening gowns and walking costumes, pelisses and spencers, bonnets and gloves. She had more clothing than she had ever imagined possible, each piece more luxurious than anything she had touched in her previous life. Mary had dressed her hair in an elegant style, drawing it up with pins and allowing a few artful curls to frame her face. Grace barely recognized herself in the mirror. She looked almost presentable, though her hands still showed the marks of her former life. No amount of cream could completely erase the scars and roughness left by 21 years of harsh labor. The carriage ride to Hartwell Manor was brief, but felt interminable. Grace sat rigidly on the cushioned bench, her hands folded in her lap, acutely aware of every bump in the road. Lord Hawthorne, sitting across from her, seemed to sense her nervousness. "Remember," he said quietly, "you owe these people nothing. You are attending as a courtesy, not as a supplicant. Your worth is not determined by their approval. You are a gentlewoman of independent fortune, the daughter of a respected man, and you have demonstrated intelligence and capability that would impress any reasonable person. Easy to say, my lord, when you have always had approval, when you have never been the object of speculation and whispered gossip. He was quiet for a moment. I lost my wife and child 12 years ago. For years after, I was pitied, avoided, treated as though grief were contagious. I know what it is to be marked as different, to feel eyes upon you weighing your adequacy, finding you wanting or broken. It is never easy. But you are stronger than you realize, Grace. You have survived things that would have destroyed others. A dinner party is nothing compared to what you have already endured. Grace found unexpected comfort in his words. She had not considered that someone of his station might understand feeling out of place, being judged and found wanting. Thank you, my lord. You are most welcome, and Grace, I will be there throughout the evening. If anyone makes you uncomfortable, you need only catch my eye. We can always plead fatigue or previous engagement and leave early. Hartwell Manor blazed with candlelight as they approached, a substantial country house of red brick with white columns flanking the entrance. Carriages lined the drive, discharging guests in evening finery. Grace swallowed hard, fighting the urge to ask Lord Hawthorne to turn around, to take her back to Kingsmere where she felt safe. But she had not survived the hardships of St. Agatha's by being a coward. She would face this test as she had faced everything else, with whatever courage she could muster. They were announced at the entrance to the drawing room. Lord Hawthorne, Earl of Kingsmere, Miss Grace Marlowe. The assembled company turned as one to examine her with the frank curiosity of those who believed themselves entitled to judge. Grace felt the weight of their scrutiny like a physical thing. There were perhaps 20 guests in total, ranging from elderly dowagers in turbans and jewels to young couples barely older than Grace herself. All were dressed in the finest evening attire, the ladies in silks and satins, the gentlemen in impeccably tailored coats and pristine cravats. Lady Minerva Hartwell proved to be a handsome woman of perhaps 50 years, with keen hazel eyes and a direct manner that suggested she tolerated no foolishness. She came forward immediately, her bearing regal but not unkind. "Lord Hawthorne, how delightful to see you," she said, extending her hand. "And this must be Miss Marlowe. My dear, you are most welcome to my home. His lordship has told me of your remarkable story." Grace curtsied, grateful that the dance master's endless lessons had trained her body to move properly, even when her mind felt paralyzed with anxiety. "You are very kind, Lady Minerva. Thank you for including me in your gathering." "Not kind, my dear. Curious. It is not every day that a young woman of fortune appears from nowhere, particularly one with such an unusual history. But come, you must meet my other guests. I am sure they are all agog to make your acquaintance." The introductions that followed were a blur of names and titles. Sir Edmund Carstairs and his wife, Lady Carstairs. Mr. and Mistress Wentworth. The Honourable Miss Sophronia Talbot and her brother Mr. Jameson Talbot. Lord and Lady Haverstoke. And most memorably, Lady Honoria Vexley, a sharp-faced woman of indeterminate age who examined Grace with the cold assessment of someone appraising livestock at market. Grace curtsied and murmured appropriate responses to each introduction, acutely aware of the speculation in every pair of eyes. She could practically hear their thoughts. Where had she come from? Was her fortune legitimate? What was her connection to Lord Hawthorne? Was there some impropriety in their arrangement? It was Lady Honoria who delivered the evening's first true challenge. After the initial introductions were complete and the guests had begun to circulate with glasses of sherry, she approached Grace with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How fascinating," Lady Honoria said, her voice carrying clearly across the drawing room. "To discover oneself an heiress after so many years of poverty. One might almost call it a fairy tale, though of course," she added with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "fairy tales are rarely quite what they seem." The room went silent, Grace felt every gaze upon her, waiting to see how she would respond to this veiled attack. She could feel her heart pounding, her palms growing damp. But she had not endured the cruelty of the workhouse by being unable to read hostility or defend herself. "Indeed, Lady Honoria," Grace said calmly. "Fairy tales typically involve magic and wishes. My situation involved fraud, negligence, and theft. I would not call those things fantastic at all. They are, sadly, all too common in our world." A slight smile tugged at Lady Minerva's lips. "Well said, Miss Marlowe." Lady Honoria's smile froze. "I merely meant that it must be quite overwhelming to suddenly find oneself in possession of such means after a life of labor." "It is overwhelming," Grace agreed. "But then, I imagine it would be equally overwhelming for someone accustomed to having their affairs managed by others to suddenly need to understand their own finances. Fortunately, I have had excellent instruction from Lord Hawthorne in matters of investment and property management. Did you know, for instance, that while the Navy 5% are reliable, one can achieve considerably better returns with canal shares, provided one is willing to study the trade routes?" Several of the gentlemen in the room looked surprised. One, an elderly man with magnificent whiskers, actually laughed. "By God, the girl knows her business. The Navy 5s are safe, but dull as dishwater. Canal shares are where the future lies. Well done, Miss Marlowe." Lady Honoria looked as though she had bitten into something sour. "How very unusual for a lady to concern herself with such matters." "I find it unusual for any person not to concern themselves with their own financial security," Grace countered, her tone polite but firm. "When one has known the absolute lack of money, Lady Honoria, one tends to view its management not as a hobby, but as a necessary survival skill." Lord Hawthorne, who had been watching this exchange with an expression of carefully controlled amusement, intervened smoothly. "Miss Marlowe has proven herself exceptionally gifted with financial analysis. She recently identified a significant discrepancy in some estate accounts that my own land agent had overlooked. I have come to rely on her perspective quite considerably." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Grace was aware that she had passed some crucial test. Several guests made a point of engaging her in further conversation throughout the evening. The elderly gentleman with the whiskers, who proved to be Sir Edmund Carstairs, spent 20 minutes discussing various investment strategies with her, seeming genuinely delighted by her insights. It was only when the dinner was concluded and the guests were preparing to depart that Grace encountered Lord Hawthorne alone in the entrance hall. He was waiting as her cloak was fetched, and his expression held something she could not quite interpret. "You were magnificent tonight," he said quietly. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. I merely answered honestly. "You did far more than that. You demonstrated intelligence, composure, and wit. You faced Lady Honoria's spite with dignity and turned it to your advantage. Your father would have been immensely proud." The mention of her father brought unexpected tears to Grace's eyes. I wish I had known him. "He was very like you," Lord Hawthorne said. "Brilliant with numbers, impatient with foolishness, kind to those who had less. He would sit in my library for hours, reading and calculating, trying to improve his modest estate through careful planning. He was one of the finest men I ever knew, and I failed him by not finding you sooner. You did not fail him, my lord. You honored his memory by searching at all. How many men would have taken the trouble?" "Too few," he admitted. "But Grace, I must speak with you about something of importance. May I call upon you tomorrow morning? There is a matter we must discuss." Grace's heart stuttered. "Of course, my lord." The carriage ride back to Kingsmere Hall was silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Grace could not imagine what Lord Hawthorne wished to discuss, but the serious tone of his voice had set her nerves on edge. She did not sleep well that night. Her mind churned through possibilities, each more alarming than the last. Perhaps he had decided she was ready to manage her own affairs and would be leaving Kingsmere Hall. Perhaps society's acceptance was not as complete as it had seemed. Perhaps he had discovered some new complication regarding her inheritance. Morning came at last. Grace dressed with particular care, though she could not have said why. When the summons came to meet Lord Hawthorne in the library, her hands were trembling. He stood by the window, his back to the door, rigid with tension. When he turned, his expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes held something that looked almost like pain. "Miss Marlowe," he began, then stopped. "Grace, I must speak to you frankly, and I fear you will think ill of me." "I could never think ill of you, my lord." "You may change your mind when you hear what I have to say." He took a breath. "I brought you here 6 months ago to fulfill a promise to your father. I intended to educate you, to prepare you to manage your inheritance, and then to help you establish yourself independently in the world. That was my duty and my intention. I understand, my lord. I have failed in that intention," he continued, his voice strained, "not in the education, but in the rest. Because at some point, during these months of teaching you and watching you grow into the remarkable woman you were always meant to be, I stopped seeing you as Thomas's daughter or as my ward. I began to see you as simply Grace, and I find that I do not want to let you go." Grace's breath caught. "My lord, I do not understand." Lord Hawthorne crossed the room to stand before her, his expression intense. "I am 42 years old. I have been alone for 12 years, convinced that part of my life was over. I have been content with duty, with managing my estates and honoring my responsibilities. But you have awakened something in me that I thought had died with my wife, and I know that it is wrong. You are 21 years my junior. You are my ward, under my protection. The power I hold over your life and your future makes any feeling I might have inappropriate at best and exploitative at worst." "You have never exploited me," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have given me freedom, education, a future I could never have imagined. And yet I want to take that freedom away," he said bitterly, his hands clenching at his sides as if physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "I want to keep you here, to continue these evenings in the library, to see your face across the breakfast table each morning. I want things I have no right to want, so I must do the only honorable thing possible." He withdrew a document from his coat and laid it on the desk between them. "This is a deed of trust, irrevocable and complete. It transfers full control of your inheritance to you, with no conditions and no oversight from me. You will manage it entirely as you see fit. Additionally, I have arranged for you to take possession of Marlowe Cottage, your father's property in Hampshire. It has been renovated and is ready for occupancy. You may live there independently, or you may choose to remain in London under the chaperonage of my aunt, Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, who has agreed to sponsor you for the season should you wish it." Grace stared at the document, her mind struggling to comprehend what he was saying. "You are sending me away?" "I am setting you free," he corrected. "Completely free. Free from any obligation to me. Free from any suggestion that your fortune is tied to my goodwill. Because any affection between us can only be genuine if you have the power to walk away from it." "And if I do not wish to walk away?" Lord Hawthorne's eyes met hers, and she saw in them a longing that matched her own. "Then that choice must be yours to make, freely and without coercion. I will not court you while I hold any power over you. I will not ask for your affection when you might feel obligated to give it. I care for you too deeply to risk such a thing." Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "You care for me?" "More than I can properly express," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "You are brilliant and brave and honest in ways I had forgotten the world could be. You face each challenge with such courage, such determination. You took 21 years of hardship and transformed it into strength. I find myself in awe of you. And," his voice dropped to barely a whisper, "I find myself falling in love with you. But that love can only mean anything if you are absolutely certain it is not born of gratitude or dependence." Grace crossed to the desk and picked up the document. The legal language was complex, but its meaning was clear. He was giving her everything, asking nothing in return, removing himself from any position of authority over her life. It was the most profound gift anyone had ever given her. "How long must we be apart?" she asked. "As long as you need to be certain of your own heart. 6 months, a year, however long it takes for you to build a life that is entirely your own. And then, if you still wish it, I will court you properly. I will seek your father's blessing at his graveside. I will do everything correctly, with no shadow of impropriety." Grace set down the document and looked at the man before her. He was offering her freedom, independence, the ability to choose her own path without any obligation. It was what every woman should have, what so few ever received. "You are wrong about one thing, my lord," she said softly. "What is that?" "You said any feeling between us could only be genuine if I had the power to walk away. But I have always had that power. From the moment you found me in that workhouse, you gave me choices. You asked my consent. You taught me to value my own opinion. You never demanded anything of me that I did not freely give. So when I say that I care for you, that these months have been the happiest of my life, that the thought of leaving here fills me with sorrow, you must believe that I speak from my own heart, not from obligation." "Grace," he breathed. "However," she continued, "I understand your concern. Society will always whisper that I was influenced by gratitude, by dependence. And I would not have you subject to such gossip, so I will accept your proposal. I will take possession of Marlowe Cottage. I will learn to manage my affairs entirely independently. And when I have done so, when I can prove to the world and to myself that I am capable of standing alone, then I will choose you. Not because you found me, but because you are worth choosing." Lord Hawthorne reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek. "You are remarkable." "I learned from an excellent teacher," she replied. The following week, Grace departed for Hampshire accompanied by Lord Hawthorne's aunt, Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, who had agreed to serve as chaperone and companion. Lady Beatrice proved to be a formidable woman in her 60s, with silver hair, piercing blue eyes, and a forthright manner that Grace found unexpectedly refreshing after months of careful social maneuvering. "My nephew tells me you have a brilliant head for accounts," Lady Beatrice said as their carriage rolled through the Hampshire countryside. "Unusual for a woman, but then your entire situation is unusual. I suppose we must make the best of it." "I will endeavor not to disappoint your expectations, my lady," Grace replied carefully. "Oh, I expect you to be entirely irregular and scandalous," Lady Beatrice said cheerfully. "A workhouse girl who taught herself mathematics and discovered her own inheritance? You could hardly be more shocking if you tried. But Victor assures me you are both intelligent and honorable, which are the only qualities that truly matter. The rest is merely society's nonsense, and I have lived too long to be overly concerned with society's opinions." Grace found herself warming to the older woman. "You do not mind being associated with someone of questionable background?" "My dear child, I am a widow of independent means with no children to scandalize and a fortune substantial enough that society must tolerate my eccentricities. I can befriend whomever I please. Besides, I find your story fascinating. To survive such circumstances and emerge with your intellect intact speaks to remarkable character. That is far more impressive than being born to the right family and accomplishing nothing of note." Marlowe Cottage came into view as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields. Grace leaned forward, eager for her first glimpse of the property that had belonged to her father. It was a charming house of mellow brick, 2 stories tall with a slate roof and climbing roses framing the entrance. Not grand by aristocratic standards, but substantial and well-maintained. The grounds extended to include several acres of productive land, a small stable, and a walled garden visible behind the main house. "It is beautiful," Grace whispered. "Your father was very proud of it," Lady Beatrice said gently. "Victor told me Thomas worked tirelessly to improve the property. He wanted to leave you something of value, something that would provide for your future. He succeeded, I think. The house had been prepared for their arrival. The housekeeper, Mistress Davison, a capable woman of middle years, greeted them at the door and provided a tour of the premises. The main floor consisted of a drawing room, a dining parlor, a library that had clearly been Thomas Marlowe's domain, and a morning room with windows overlooking the garden. The upper floor held 4 bedchambers, each modestly but comfortably furnished. The servants' quarters were in the attic, and the kitchen, still room, and various service areas occupied the ground floor. Grace found herself drawn immediately to the library. The shelves were filled with books on mathematics, philosophy, agriculture, and classical literature. A large desk dominated one corner, its surface scarred with the marks of years of use. Papers were still stacked neatly, as though Thomas Marlowe might return at any moment to continue his work. "He spent most of his time in this room," Lady Beatrice said, following Grace inside. "Victor told me your father was happiest when surrounded by his books and calculations. He was working on a treatise about improved agricultural methods when he died. It was never finished." Grace ran her fingers along the desk's worn surface, imagining the father she had never known sitting here, working by candlelight, thinking of the daughter he hoped would someday inherit all he had built. The loss of what might have been struck her with unexpected force. She might have grown up here, learned at his knee, discussed philosophy and mathematics with him. Instead, she had scrubbed laundry in a workhouse while his books gathered dust. "I will finish it," she said quietly. "Finish what, my dear?" "His treatise. If his notes are here, I will complete his work. It is the least I can do to honor his memory." Lady Beatrice smiled. "I think you and I shall get along admirably, Grace Marlowe." The following days established a routine. Grace rose early and immediately set about learning everything about her property. She reviewed all the accounts going back 5 years, identifying every income source and expenditure. She met personally with each of the 3 tenant farmers who worked her land, asking detailed questions about their crops, their methods, their challenges. She inspected the fields, the fences, the irrigation systems. The tenants were initially wary, unaccustomed to dealing with a female landowner, particularly one so young. But Grace's intelligent questions and genuine interest in their work gradually won their respect. She discovered that the main tenant, Mr. Edmund Wickham, had indeed been subletting the eastern fields without reporting the income. When she confronted him with the evidence, backed by meticulous calculations, he had little choice but to acknowledge his deception. "You owe this estate £368 and 15 shillings, Grace informed him in her new study, her voice steady despite her nervousness at this confrontation. "I have calculated the amount based on the receipts I discovered and the rent you should have been paying for the past 5 years. Mr. Wickham, a ruddy-faced man of 40, blustered and protested. "That is a considerable sum, Miss Marlowe. I have not the ready funds to pay such an amount immediately." "Then we shall establish a payment plan," Grace said calmly. "You will pay the back rent in quarterly payments over the next 2 years. Additionally, I am raising your rent going forward to reflect the full value of the land you are working, including the eastern fields. If you find these terms unacceptable, I will seek a new tenant." "Quarterly payments," Mr. Wickham scoffed, trying to regain his footing. "You think you can just dictate terms? Your figures are likely wrong anyway." "My figures are never wrong, Mr. Wickham," Grace replied, pulling a ledger forward. She dipped her pen in ink and performed the calculation for the interest on the unpaid rent in front of him, her hand moving with practiced speed. She turned the page around so he could see. "Here is the sum. Do you wish to dispute the arithmetic?" The farmer stared at the page, then at her, his expression shifting from bluster to grudging respect. "You have a sharp head for business, miss. Too sharp by half for a young lady." "I have a fair head for arithmetic, Mr. Wickham, and a strong disinclination to be cheated. Do we have an agreement?" "Aye, miss, we have an agreement." After he left, Grace sat at her desk, her hands trembling slightly with the aftermath of confrontation. But she had done it. She had identified the fraud, calculated the losses, and negotiated a resolution. All on her own, without appealing to Lord Hawthorne or any other male authority. The sense of accomplishment was profound. Within 3 months, Grace had transformed the management of her small estate. She implemented several of her father's agricultural improvements that she had found in his notes. She renegotiated contracts with suppliers to reduce costs. She invested in better fencing that would increase the land's long-term value. The estate's annual income rose steadily, and Grace maintained detailed records of every transaction. But it was her decision to establish the Marlowe School for Forgotten Children that truly demonstrated her independence and her commitment to ensuring others would not suffer as she had. She purchased a small property adjacent to her own, a former coaching inn that had fallen into disrepair. Using a portion of her inheritance, she hired builders to renovate the structure into a proper school. Lady Beatrice supported the endeavor enthusiastically, using her social connections to recruit qualified teachers. The curriculum Grace designed was practical and comprehensive: reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and for the older students, apprenticeships in honest trades that would allow them to earn a living with dignity. "You will scandalize society," Lady Beatrice warned her cheerfully. "An unmarried woman of 22 establishing a school without male oversight? The gossips will have a field day." "Let them gossip," Grace said. "I spent 21 years being invisible because no one cared enough to look for me. These children will not be invisible. They will have education, opportunity, and the knowledge that someone values them enough to invest in their futures." The school opened in June of 1819 with its first class of 30 students, all children from workhouses or orphanages in the surrounding counties. Grace personally interviewed each child, ensuring they understood that this was an opportunity for genuine transformation. She hired a superintendent, Mr. Charles Grenville, a former schoolmaster of impeccable credentials who shared her vision of practical education for disadvantaged children. The response from local society was indeed mixed. Some praised her charity and her commitment to improving the lives of the poor. The vicar of the local church delivered a sermon commending her Christian compassion. But others whispered that she was overstepping her place, that such undertakings were inappropriate for an unmarried woman, that she was setting a dangerous example by acting independently of male guidance. Grace ignored them all. She had spent 21 years being told she had no place, that she was nothing and no one. She would not accept such limitations now. She had the means, the intelligence, and the determination to make a difference. That was all that mattered. 8 months after leaving Kingsmere Hall, Grace stood in her study at Marlowe Cottage, reviewing the school's quarterly accounts. Enrollment had exceeded all expectations, reaching 50 students by the autumn term. The children were thriving, learning not just academic subjects but self-respect and the belief that their lives could be different from what society had prescribed. It was then that Lord Hawthorne arrived. Grace looked up from her ledgers to find him standing in the doorway of her study, as though her thoughts had somehow summoned him into being. He looked older than she remembered, as though the months apart had cost him as dearly as they had cost her. "Miss Marlowe," he said formally, "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I could not stay away any longer." Grace set down her pen with hands that trembled, only slightly. "You are always welcome here, my lord." He entered the study, his gaze taking in the neat stacks of account books, the correspondence from her tenants, the plans for expanding the school. "I have been following your progress," he admitted. "Lady Beatrice writes to me weekly with updates. She tells me you have accomplished more in 8 months than many land agents achieve in years." "I had an excellent teacher," Grace said quietly. "No," he shook his head. "You had natural brilliance that merely needed the opportunity to flourish. Everything you have achieved here is yours alone." "Not alone," she corrected. "I have had support and guidance. But I have made my own decisions, managed my own affairs. I have proven to myself that I can stand independent of any man's protection or provision." "You have," he agreed. "So I must ask you, Grace Marlowe, now that you have your own fortune, your own home, your own purpose in this world, do you still want a man who has spent these months counting the days until he might honorably seek your company again?" Grace rose from her chair and crossed to stand before him. "I do not want just any man, my lord. I want you. Not because you saved me, though you did. Not because you educated me, though you did that as well. I want you because you saw me when I was invisible. Because you treated me as capable when the world told me I was worthless. Because you gave me freedom when you could have kept control. Because you make me laugh, and you challenge my thinking, and because I am happier in your presence than I have ever been anywhere else." "Grace," he whispered, reaching for her hands, "I have loved you since the day you calculated compound interest in your head and then lectured me about diversification. I have loved your courage and your intelligence and your refusal to accept anything less than truth. These months without you have been agony." "Then perhaps," Grace said, "we need not endure any more such months. Does that mean you will consent to marry me? Properly, with all the time for courtship that you deserve?" "It means," Grace replied, "that I would be honored to become your wife, on one condition." "Anything," he said immediately. "That we remain partners in all things. That you continue to value my opinion on matters of finance and estate management. That we work together as equals for the rest of our lives." Lord Hawthorne smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in 8 months. "My dear Miss Marlowe, I would have it no other way. Your mind is one of the finest I have ever encountered. I would be a fool to ignore such a resource." "Then I accept your proposal, my lord." "Victor," he corrected gently. "If we are to be equals, you must call me Victor." "Then I accept your proposal, Victor," Grace said, savoring the intimacy of his given name. He drew her closer, his arms coming around her with infinite gentleness. "I love you, Grace Marlowe. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." "You already deserve me," she said against his chest, "because you gave me the one thing I needed most. You gave me the chance to discover who I truly was." They were married 3 months later, in the spring of 1819, at the parish church where Grace's father was buried. The ceremony was small but dignified, attended by those who had come to respect Grace for her accomplishments rather than those who merely sought to gossip about her unusual history. The wedding breakfast was held at Marlowe Cottage, which would become their country residence, while Kingsmere Hall would serve as their primary seat. Grace insisted on maintaining her school, which Victor not only supported but helped to expand. His connections and influence opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed, while her management and vision ensured that the institution thrived. 2 years after their marriage, Grace sat in the library at Kingsmere Hall, their son Thomas asleep in a cradle by her feet while she reviewed the quarterly accounts for the school. Enrollment had grown to 120 students. They had established a scholarship fund that would support the education of impoverished children in perpetuity. And Grace had published, under a carefully chosen pseudonym, a manual titled Practical Accounting for Women, which had caused considerable scandal, but had also sold remarkably well. Victor entered the library and paused to watch her work, a smile playing at his lips. "You look remarkably fierce when you are calculating compound interest." Grace looked up and returned his smile. "I am determining whether we can afford to expand the school again. The waiting list grows longer each month." "We can afford whatever you deem necessary," Victor said, settling into the chair beside her. "Between your management of our properties and the returns from your investments, we are considerably more prosperous than when we married. Then I believe we should purchase the Ashby property adjacent to the school. It would allow us to double our capacity and add workshops for the apprenticeships." "An excellent notion. Draft a proposal, and I will review it." Grace set aside her ledgers and reached for her husband's hand. Do you ever regret it? Marrying someone so thoroughly unsuitable for your station? Victor raised her hand to his lips. Every single day, I regret that I did not find you sooner. But marry you? Never. You are the finest thing that has ever happened to me. You gave me back my life, Grace. You reminded me that there was more to existence than duty and grief. And you gave me mine, she replied softly. 21 years forgotten. And then you walked through that door and saw me. Their son stirred in his cradle, making the small sounds that presaged waking. Grace rose to lift him, cradling him against her chest. Thomas had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and he was already showing signs of inheriting her fascination with numbers, reaching for the wooden abacus that Victor had given him. Do you think he will understand someday? Grace asked. Where I came from, what I survived. I think he will understand that his mother is a woman of extraordinary courage and intelligence, Victor said. I think he will grow up seeing women as capable and worthy of education, because that is what his mother demonstrates every day. And I think he will be proud of the school that bears his grandfather's name and provides opportunities to children who might otherwise be forgotten. Grace looked down at her son, then at her husband, then at the library that had become her sanctuary and her classroom. She thought of the workhouse, where she had been invisible for so long, and of Mistress Grimsby, who was now serving a prison sentence for fraud and exploitation. She thought of the children at the Marlowe school, each of them being given the chances she had been denied. And she thought that perhaps being forgotten for 21 years, as terrible as it had given her something invaluable. It had taught her to see the invisible, to value the discarded, to understand that worth was not determined by society's notice or approval. I am grateful, she said quietly. Victor looked surprised. Grateful for what you endured? Grateful for all of it, Grace clarified. The suffering taught me strength. The invisibility taught me to see others who are overlooked. The theft of my childhood gave me the determination to ensure that other children do not suffer the same fate. And the miraculous finding, gave me you. So yes, I am grateful. Not for the cruelty, but for what I became in spite of it. You would have been extraordinary regardless of circumstances, Victor said. Your brilliance, your compassion, your courage, those are inherent to who you are. Perhaps, Grace allowed. But I might never have discovered them without being forced to rely on myself. I might never have learned to value my own worth if society had simply handed me acceptance. Sometimes I think we must be broken before we can become truly strong. Victor drew her and their son into his embrace, the three of them standing together in the golden afternoon light of the library. Then I am grateful too, he said. Grateful that somehow, against all probability, I was allowed to find you. Grateful that Thomas's dying wish led me to search. Grateful for every moment I have been privileged to know you. Grace leaned into his strength, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warm weight of their child between them. She thought of the girl she had been, standing at a washboard in a Southwark workhouse, invisible and forgotten. And she thought of the woman she had become, managing estates and educating children, and loving this good man who had seen her when no one else could. The journey from that workhouse to this library had been impossible, improbable, extraordinary. But she had made it, not through fairy tale magic or wishful thinking, but through intelligence and courage and the incredible fortune of being found by someone who valued those qualities. She had been forgotten for 21 years, but she would spend the rest of her life ensuring that no child would be forgotten again. That was her purpose, her mission, her way of transforming suffering into meaning. And standing in her husband's arms, her son sleeping peacefully between them, Grace Marlowe knew that she had found exactly where she belonged. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story of resilience, love, and second chances touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of courage, redemption, and hope.